Hi, I'm Vicki Bestor, and I'm here to interview Kristina Troost, who was the chair of the NCC from 1998 to 2000, and led the year 2000 conference, and by way of full disclosure, is the person who's responsible for hiring me to the NCC. I wanted to set the scene just a little bit for those who wouldn't remember what NCC, the World Japanese Studies, was like in 1998. Actually, what I wanted to go back to is what the world was like in 1991 and 92 when NCC was being founded. At that point, the most striking thing was that the world of Japanese studies still thought Japan had money, but the bubble had already burst. And so NCC, strangely, is an organization that was founded at a time when the world thought we could just go out and ask for money and they'd support us. Well, that never happened. And it has always been a trial for NCC and for Japanese studies. And despite that, NCC has done many things, and Chris was one of the people who did and laid the groundwork for many of the most important ones early on. So I want to begin by placing Chris within the field. She is different than many in that she was one of the first PhDs to have a Japanese studies librarianship position. These days, everywhere you look, you see lots of people that do. But back in the early 90s, most of the people who were librarians in the field were native speakers who had come to the States for various reasons, and few people had, like Chris, moved from an academic background into librarianship. We are fortunate that she did that. And so I want to start out with asking Chris, how did she get there?
I started a PhD at Harvard, and then my husband found a job at North Carolina State, and we moved to North Carolina in 1977. And I got through my prelims and applied for grants to study in Japan, and my husband got a Fulbright to teach American Studies in Japan, and we went to Japan in 1980, and I was there for 2.5 years or so. I came home in the fall of 1982. And at that point, I was pregnant, and then I had 2 babies, and my dissertation percolated, but it took me until 1990 to finish it. I did a lot of other things, but it also was strengthened by the fact that I ran a conference at one point on common property, and I learned so much about common property and the political science theories behind it that it really influenced my dissertation and made it stronger. So when I was finishing my dissertation in 1990, I started looking around for jobs, and I didn't really want to take a 1-year job anywhere because I had 2 children and a husband with tenure. And so I talked to everybody I knew and asked them if they had any ideas. And Andy Gordon said, well, there'll be a half-time job at Duke starting in the fall. And so I mailed off my dissertation and interviewed 3 days later and got the job. It was a great way to enter the field, but there is no such thing as a half-time job, just half-time pay. So I started at Duke in October of 90, and so I learned a lot. And I traveled in the spring of 91 to visit libraries in Maryland, Georgetown and Maryland, and the Library of Congress. And then I went up and visited Penn, and Carl Kaler was very welcoming. And I visited Yale and Harvard, although they were much less substantive visits. And it was also my graduation. At any rate, so along came the possibility to apply for the Maruzen microfilm set. And so I applied because that's what it seemed appropriate to do. It would really have helped our collection. And much to everyone's surprise, I got Duke was awarded the grant. Of course, we never were one of the people who were selected. Of course, we never got anything other than the index, which is now unreadable because it was on old technology. But we were at least selected, and everybody said, "What?" So I had been to SEAL in the spring of '91 before the Hoover Conference, and they were working on a union list of periodicals at the time, and I said, "You need to include Duke's holdings. We really serve as a major lending library throughout the Southeast." And in fact, we had good solid holdings of not very many journals, but the ones we had all the way back. We had Chuo Koron and its previous publication, Hansei Sashi, I think. Anyway, and we had all the historical journals and full runs of them. And I was sort of like, I felt as though I was met with great skepticism, but Duke's holdings were included. And so the same thing was true. People were really curious about me when I was invited to the Hoover Conference simply because Duke had been selected for the Maruzen Meiji collection.
Okay. Excellent. Can I interject here? Because I want to give a little bit of background so that people understand that about the Hoover Conference a little bit. In November of 1991, what has become known as the Hoover Conference was held at Stanford, named after the Hoover Library, the building in which it was held. And it brought together the major Japanese studies librarians from representing key regions.
But the interesting thing about the people who were invited to Hoover was it was the same people who participated in each of the different library regional groups. So the one on the East Coast was just the four big institutions, Harvard, and Columbia, whereas the one in the Midwest included Ohio State and Pittsburgh and Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Indiana. And the one on the West Coast included Oregon, as well as Washington, UCLA, San Diego.
Oregon.
Even Arizona. The one in the Midwest included Missouri and Kansas. So the West Coast and the Midwest groups were much more inclusive. And so when the guest list for the Hoover was drawn up, all of those groups were included. The East Coast was really limited to the four institutions until suddenly Duke had been awarded the Maruzen Meiji collection, and so Duke was included. But there were several other collections that should have been included and weren't, and by that time there wasn't the money to bring people. So, but Penn and Cornell were not there.
And so at the Hoover Conference, was it clear that the funders had a definite agenda to sort of combine efforts and create an organization that would become the NCC?
To be honest, how clear it was, you'd have to talk to people who are more senior than me. I really came in as a complete neophyte. Maybe I understood that by the end of the conference, but I had no idea about the background when I was invited. So we had 9 national planning teams, and we each produced a report, and it was clear we expected that to go somewhere. But the agenda behind it, maybe Amy would know, but I did not know going into it what was going to come out of it. I just knew who was funding it.
Right. Well, at the Hoover, it was announced toward the end of the meeting that the NCC was going to be founded. But I think no one much knew what that meant. The following month, in December of 91, was when the Japan Foundation circulated a letter to all of the field, not just libraries, but to all of the field, announcing that NCC had been founded and that Amy Heinrich would be the first chair of NCC. So when did you get involved in NCC first, and how were you enlisted?
Well, probably the most formal way I was involved was by being appointed to the Japan Foundation Library Subcommittee that was to advise the American Advisory Committee
about giving books to different libraries?
About their grant program.
Right,
That's how I first got formally involved. I'd been on the ILL subcommittee of the National Planning Team, and I think that the NCC decided that that could be handled by SEAL, and so that moved over there, and I stayed involved with that.
Actually, I think we sort of need to go back, because what happened, as you said, there were 9 national planning teams that were formed, and they each had a group of members looking at various things: ILL, collection of serials, how to encourage retrospective conversion of data, all kinds of things. And I think it was a shock to many people in the field that all of a sudden, after the reports were submitted to the Commission and Japan Foundation, whomever, that all of a sudden it was said, okay, great, NCC is going to be in charge of all of these things now. And it was rather overwhelming for NCC, given that it had been created like 2 months before and had no staff and was an ad hoc committee of faculty and librarians from around the country. So it was pretty hard for them to, decide anything, much less substantively say, okay, we're going to concentrate on X. However, there was one thing that was very clearly put in their lap that they needed to concentrate on, and that is what became known as the multi-volume SETS grants program, which many people have told me, and probably you over the years, that it was the MVS project for which the NCC was created.
I thought there were a lot of things that they were concerned about when it was created. They were looking at a lot of librarians retiring in the next decade.
Yeah, that's true.
Wanted to make sure that those people were going to be replaced, and they were quite concerned about that.
Sure.
ILL in those days was, I guess you could say, a real hassle. Most libraries had not yet done retrospective conversion. So if you wanted to buy a book before people started cataloging online in the late 80s, you had, borrow a book, you had to guess where it was. And there was a huge paper catalog you could look through, but some of the major libraries didn't want to have people just going to them because they assumed that they had it. They wanted people, so they were instituting great fees and trying to make it difficult to borrow from them. We don't need to name names. So there were a bunch of issues out there, and things were just beginning to be electronic. And certainly early on, faculty at major institutions had traveled to Japan and suddenly used these databases in Japan, like Nexus.
Yeah.
Wonder why we didn't have access here. So I would be more inclined to think that the MVS project was low-hanging fruit. The Friendship Commission was willing to fund it, and we could get faculty and librarians to serve on the committee, and Yuki
carrot and stick.
Right. And Yuki Shimatsu drew up a great proposal. So there were other things that they also wanted to tackle. To get money for recon was almost impossible. So that one actually went to the individual libraries, which eventually did recon for their non-Roman script collections.
Yeah. Well, recon, I remember being talked about greatly when I first came to NCC, and it was already clear at that point that it was an impossible task, that A, there was no way you could, quote, fund it, and B, even if you had a lot of money to throw around, there was no way that you could necessarily convince any given institution to do it.
So, yeah. So I think, it started out with MVS and low-hanging fruit when there was no one other than Amy working for the NCC, and she got this volunteer committee. But it quickly took on some of the other charges from the national planning team.
Exactly.
And then by having faculty on the committee who saw other needs, it moved into all sorts of other projects. The Japan Art Catalog Project, Image Use Protocol, the ILL with Japan. All these things were important initiatives, but it took a little time to get them started.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Well, during your term, talk about the year 2000 conference, because that was during your term, and we hadn't gotten even close to image use protocol at that point. But what I remember being in addition to ILL, the other major conversation that I remember really being productive that came out of there resulted in the DRC, the Digital Resources Committee. And at that point, when we were first at year 2000, we were talking about consortial licensing and how we would promote that notion. And it all grew from there. Can you talk about that?
To be honest, I don't remember that much. I do, but I remember more than anything else is that as I reviewed what had worked and what had not worked over the past decade, it was clear that if there were local interests, you could build on them. So like the MVS project, individual libraries suggested titles that were locally needed, but they also then contributed to the national collection because they weren't out anywhere else, and they were going to be provided through ILL. But it was this combination of local interest and national needs that were successful. When they worked together, things worked. And that's what I remember more than anything. That and the fact that the NCC always had a Japan rep and had a rep for a long time from ARL, so that we were able to get university librarians on board. And we had this connection in Japan that allowed us to, gave us more standing. So we were more successful in negotiating with Japan. And so we built from there. I don't have this sense of having accomplished anything major in my years there, other than organizing this conference and getting everybody on board for it. But yeah, the ILL thing started was just barely initiated by Dorothy Greger with Waseda before I started, I think. And then the ANUL, Association of National University Libraries Conference, happened during my tenure. That was the origins of the gift project.
Yes,
so
I remember that.
Yeah. So, and an awful lot of librarians who are currently in the field, their introduction to the field really was the year 2000 conference.
Yes, it was. And one of the key discussions that also came out of that through the breakout sessions and through the subsequent discussions was long-term librarian training. And as you have mentioned, the generational change that was then upon us and the need to create the mentoring and the training. Now, it didn't happen till the following term, till Satye's term, but the big conference that we all did, and you were very much involved, the conference, the Junior Librarian Training Conference in 2002 or 3. That was really a key event that helped to usher in that new generation.
And digital resources were just beginning to come out between 1997 and 2000. I think that we've done a lot with consortial licensing, not sponsored necessarily by the NCC, but by individual librarians who then build a network of libraries that want to subscribe. But the world has really changed in terms of what's available. There's still a lot to be tackled. The fact that so many publishers are releasing things on CD, which is just not practical for most U.S. libraries, has got to change, but we're not done yet.
No, we're not done yet, not by any shot. But you yourself, after your term at NCC, had a very, very big role in SEAL. And as a former chair of NCC, I personally believe that you helped to grow NCC's collaborations with SEAL on a more equal footing. And I'm thinking particularly about how you wrote a wonderful article about the role of MVS as a model of cooperative collection development that other fields look at, and also the various other models that NCC became, as it did for the Korean Studies Librarian Group, which subsequently has formed and has become very important in the field. So if you can, I'd really like you to talk about your sort of broader missionary work within the field in that regard as SEAL president and so forth.
So in terms of missionary work, my real mission is to think of things nationally or internationally and to involve everyone who is willing to step forward and be creative. We need to think of everything on a national level and to have any number of initiatives, digital or otherwise, to build our support for faculty. So national level collections, rather than trying to just build the collection of everything at your institution. I also think my other missionary activity is working with faculty, that you have to work together with them. And faculty brought ideas to the NCC by serving on the NCC. Tom Ryder
so much
initiated the JACK project. I don't know who brought the image use protocol idea to the NCC because that was after my time. But again, I believe that was faculty.
Oh, absolutely. It was, yes.
And I can remember conversations when I was on the NCC and Pat Steinhoff and John Campbell were on it about data and trying to get access to data in Japan, which was so often locked down. And Pat was trying to play a role by talking to the shakken at Todai. That's two acronyms that nobody may know, but maybe only the listeners of this group will know, at the University of Tokyo, a research institute that had a lot of data, but they were keeping it behind a wall or not even on the internet. So nobody could access it. And yet faculty in the States often do a lot of work from their offices or from their homes, and they need remote access to things. So there were issues then, there are issues now. The big one right now, I think, is access to the National Diet Library's online collection of books. And they're willing to open it up in the States, but their rules at this point do not reflect how we work.
Yeah.
And are not practical to implement. So that's still in process as a negotiation. It would be a wonderful boon to isolated scholars, which I was an advocate for from the beginning when I was at the conference. That was what made me an effective member of the conference because I had worked with people scattered in the Southeast at institutions that might not even provide for ILL or wouldn't pay for ILL or had difficulty with ordering anything that wasn't straightforward and in English. And the NCC has always tried to advocate for those, whereas I don't think SEAL thinks of its mission in the same way as serving all the libraries that might have a scholar working on China, Japan, or Korea, but no librarian. They're really a community of librarians in the field, and their most direct users are their own faculty and students, and they can keep them very busy. And to be able to reach out beyond their own institution is not necessarily rewarded by their institution. So I came into the field with a different view, in part because I'd lived in North Carolina for the better part of, 15 years? Is that right? 13 years? And I'd been part of the Triangle East Asia Colloquium. So I already thought of it as a triangle thing, and so I came into my job thinking I was supporting state and Carolina. And then I just wanted to make myself useful. So I contacted faculty when Mark Ravinus started at Emory, and I knew Emory didn't have a Japanese collection at that point. I wrote him and said, I do a table of contents service. Would you like me to provide you the tables of contents of journals as they come out? And so I felt that the whole Southeast was my territory. And now, of course, there are a couple of librarians at one at Emory and one or two in Florida, but there was nobody then. So
no, you were the first one down there. And I remember very clearly whenever you would talk, what you just said was absolutely the focus. You were concerned about faculty and wanted to make sure that NCC never forgot its need to look broadly and to serve the underserved. And that is exactly what you have always done. In fact, the most recent colloquium for your retirement, one of your colleagues referred to you as the glue that kept them together all of these years. And it's phenomenal that a librarian of all things is honored and respected by an entire region of the country the way that you are. And we are very lucky to have you.
I talked to everybody, which meant that I knew that so-and-so was working on this and so-and-so was working on this. It was useful for me to justify a purchase of an expensive set, but it also meant sometimes I knew that we had someone working on manga, filling in for Jennifer, and that Ann Allison had a graduate student who was interested in similar issues. And of course, she didn't know about Ryan Holmberg, so I put the two of them together. But this was just a function of the fact that everybody needed help from me. So they all came and told me what they wanted. And I could then tell other people, hey, so-and-so is doing something sort of similar. You might want to talk to them and you might find it useful. So,
but as you have said, the key is that your door was always open, literally and figuratively and virtually.
Yes, and let me tell you, emails can eat up your day. And there's a lot that I could do that other librarians could probably have done, but the faculty or the students couldn't do for themselves. There's stuff that hides behind not paywalls, but Google doesn't search deep enough into the archive, into the website to find stuff. And I would know about that where it was, and I would find the links and send them. There were things that were published in the Meiji period that nobody would lend from Japan, and I could figure out how to get those, because NDL things from the Meiji period were always up freely, but they don't have the collection of record for the Meiji period. There's a lot of stuff they don't have. So through personal connections, I could get somebody at a university to scan it. So there were things that, other librarians could have done those things, but the faculty I worked with were very grateful because they had a librarian, and there hadn't been anybody at Duke until I was hired, and they needed somebody. So,
well, that's part of it, in that there was no model for you to follow. So you saw the need and you followed that.
right. Yeah. And I certainly had been there as a scholar trying to I wanted to find books on population in the pre-1600 era, and they were hard to find. And there were no comprehensive bibliographies in those days. It was before Naxos, and WorldCat had a lot of books WorldCat did not have books published much before 1990. So I was used to that struggle of finding information. And
there wasn't much in Japanese in WorldCat either.
Right. That's what I was trying to say. Thanks.
Yeah.
What I meant was books published in Japanese before about 88 or 85 just weren't in the Arlen, which was a related to, it was similar to WorldCat and has been merged into WorldCat now. It was a separate institution at the time.
Do you want to talk at all about this point that I raised about ARL, and when ARL left NCC and with the union list? I mean, that is really a different subject, but it was a real strong impression that I had. I made the note here about remembering going to that meeting. You and I attended it, and Sachi attended it. And of course, Maureen Donovan attended it. And it was, to me, I was just really an observer, but I was shocked to discover the extent to which ARL had made a decision about a project that Ohio State was in charge of, and essentially told them that from their perspective, it was over.
I was there at that discussion. I remember the outcome. I think the outcome was right.
Sure, I do too.
When I began in the field, union lists were incredibly important. And I often went to the one that was published in the early 90s to see who held a journal and what years.
Mm-hmm.
But now, even if holdings are not in WorldCat, and some libraries have put their holdings in WorldCat, you can click on the link and go to their catalog and find out if they have.
Right.
And I don't know what ILL does because I've never worked in it. But if I'm helping somebody, I will always tell them, put in the notes field that this is held somewhere, because there are libraries that put up holdings if they have only one issue of a journal, and that's crazy. And I have learned the hard way, or learned through experience, you really don't want to do that.
Yeah.
There were a couple of things at one point we thought we needed to make sure that have a cooperative project to make sure that we all got all the Kyo published in Japan.
Right, I remember that.
Universities. And now the proposals came forward just as it was getting to be almost possible to do this, but also just as it was no longer necessary to do it. Mm-hmm. And because so many of those Kyo are now in institutional repositories in universities in Japan, and the others you can get through interlibrary loan if you really need an article, it just is no longer necessary to have them all held in the US. Mm-hmm. The librarian who proposed it shifted with the times, but at the time she proposed it, the ground was shifting underneath us and we didn't need it anymore.
Yeah.
When I came into the field, I was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and all ready for taking on any challenges. And now that I'm stepping back, I don't want to be viewed as an old fogey, but I don't have the energy for new projects anymore either. So, but I certainly encourage them, and new ways of thinking about things, and new ways of thinking about faculty needs, which the NCC has really been out in the forefront. workshop on web archiving and IIIF was really good. That was held at Princeton in the fall of 2019, 2018, sometime in there. And I think as librarians, we've got to now gain a bunch of skills, not just PowerPoint and whatever, and WordPress, but we also need to share and not necessarily have everybody be an expert in everything. So
that's a good summing up.
So, yeah, the Japanese studies and Korean studies, for various reasons, have done a lot to think nationally. And I'm hoping to see the Chinese collections move in a more national direction in the next decade. But nobody can house all the books. Nobody can buy all the books, and nobody can have all the skills to do everything. And if you want to do digital projects, how do you also find the time to do print-based things, like even selecting titles? There's a lot of work out there, and if we think nationally, we can get it all done.
Chris, this has been a great conversation.
Well, thank you.
I always enjoy talking to you and seeing you.